An old horse breaks loose in the middle of a storm, pulling a wagon of 4 children escaping a shadowy reform camp. Along scorched trails long forgotten, it leads them through the forest, as if remembering something not human, but born of fire blood and betrayal. But what awaits at the end of the journey is more than just freedom. Subscribe now so you never miss another gripping and emotional story from our channel. The wind over Echo Hill had the weight of old stories in it. A gray horse stood still at the edge of a paddock, his coat a dusty silver, like weathered tin left too long under Texas sun. His eyes wide and knowing caught the light just enough to reveal a storm. Not of violence, but of memory. That kind of memory only animals seem to carry with grace, of things lost, of fires, survived, of voices gone. His name was Bristle, though few called him that anymore. Most just said the old one and left him to the quiet. But his eyes watched everything, especially today. Farther up the ridge, the long silhouette of a girl moved against the sky. Samantha rode alone. She always did these days. Her black boots gripped the stirrups with a balance earned from years in the saddle. Her back was straight but not stiff. Her chestnut braid swung behind her in rhythm with the hooves. The sun hadn't yet scorched the air, but already the grass below was crisp brittle under the weight of drought and summer heat. The hill pulsed in orange and ochre, its dry breath rising like ghosts from old cattle drives. Samantha leaned forward slightly and whispered to her mare, "Easy, Clover, we won't stay long." They crested the top. Below them stretched the 100-year-old ranch, Echo Hill. Its barbed fences cut the horizon like scars. In the distance, the main house shimmered with that too-perfect white paint Samantha had always hated. It used to be brown once natural, but her father changed it when the oil men started coming around. She dismounted, boots crunching into the dust. The wind came in slow and warm, carrying no scent but dry sage and the distant memory of rain. She took a few steps toward the old oak that had stood there longer than any building. Its bark was splitting in places, deep ridges running like worry lines. Samantha pressed her palm against it, rough, warm, alive. "I heard them talking," she murmured, her voice too soft for anything but the bark to hear. "They want to cut down the whole ridge? Turn it into some kind of fuel corridor? Dad says it's progress. I say he's killing the only thing real we have left." The tree said nothing. Of course it didn't. But it felt like it listened. Back at the house, Harvey Langston poured whiskey at noon. The air conditioning hummed with rich man laziness. His study was all sharp lines, steel bookshelves, thick glass-topped desk, real leather chairs that creaked when men shifted their weight to lie. A man in a navy suit, Collins from the energy company, stood at the window looking out toward the distant hills. "She's still riding that damn hill," Collins said. Harvey didn't answer, just sipped his drink. "We'll need the deal closed by Friday," Collins added, turning. "Our partners in Midland expect the land grants to come through. The pipeline's already been mapped." Harvey leaned forward, plucking a paper from the folder. It was the easement request, forged with the mayor's signature in ink just dark enough to pass casual scrutiny. "If anyone looks into this, they won't," Collins said quickly. "The mayor's a friend of ours. Just needed something in writing for the investors." Harvey set down his glass. "She's not stupid, you know," he said quietly. Collins blinked. "Who, my daughter?" The man laughed too loud for the room. "She's 13. Harvey didn't smile. Outside, Samantha tied Clover at the post, brushed dust from her jeans, and headed toward the porch. She saw the unfamiliar black SUV parked near the front steps and felt her stomach shift. Inside, she heard laughter, the fake kind. The kind men did when money was in the room. She paused at the screen door. The wood was old but still swung silent, so she opened it carefully, not making a sound. From the hallway, she could see into the study. Her father was sitting relaxed. His face had that look it wore when he was selling something. The man with him was mid-sentence, gesturing toward the window. On the desk, Samantha spotted the document. Her breath caught. A seal, familiar. Governmental. Below it, the mayor's name. But something was wrong with the signature. It looked off. The curve of the L was flat rushed. She remembered watching the mayor sign her certificate at last year's 4-H banquet. His loops were slower, more exaggerated. Her father stood then, gathering the papers, and in that moment, like some ancient instinct, he turned. Their eyes met. For a second, everything in the room vanished. There were no men, no contracts, no ranch, just 2 people, a girl and a man, who used to tell her bedtime stories about ghost horses on the hill. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her father's face flickered. Just for a second. A twitch at the edge of his jaw. Then, like shutters, it closed. "Samantha," he said, voice too calm. "You're back early." She nodded once her gaze locked. A silent accusation. He stepped toward her, a hand lifting slightly as if to pat her shoulder. But she turned away before it landed. She stepped out onto the porch and kept walking. She didn't go back to the barn. Not yet. Instead, she made her way around the side of the property to the edge of the old windbreak where the original settlers planted trees to hold back dust and time. Most were dead now, splinters of bark and fossil. But one remained, the tree she always visited, the one that felt older than even the land. She stood in front of it now, hands dusty, eyes dry. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "He's lying, selling you out." The wind stirred the leaves overhead. Not loud, just enough to make them shiver like they were trying to speak. Samantha placed her palm against the trunk again. "I saw the paper, the signature. He forged it." A pause. "I don't think he even knows why he's doing it anymore." She closed her eyes, letting her breath slow. I think he's afraid to lose, even if it means burning everything down." She stayed like that for a while. Just the tree and the silence. The sun was sinking lower, carving long shadows across the dry field. Eventually, she opened her eyes and stepped back. Then, with a quiet that held more fury than screaming ever could, she said, "They're coming for you." And then softer, "They don't know what you are." Her hand lingered on the bark. One final touch, like saying goodbye to a friend who couldn't follow. Then she turned and walked away, dust rising behind her in slow clouds. From the top of the ridge, Bristle stood watching. He didn't move, didn't blink, but the wind carried her voice even there. And something shifted in his stance. A muscle twitched, a memory stirred. Because horses remember. And some things even time can't bury. The next morning, the sun came up like it was hiding something. Samantha sat stiffly in the front office of West Echo Middle School, her fists balled in her lap. The secretary had offered her a lukewarm cup of water in a styrofoam cup. She hadn't touched it. On the wall above the filing cabinet hung a framed photo. Principal Dolores Penley, smiling with a shovel in the ground, breaking ceremony for the new science center sponsored by Langston Energy Initiative. The door to the inner office opened. "Samantha, come in," Principal Penley said, her voice syrupy and professional. Samantha stood, moving with quiet resolve. Her boots clacked against the vinyl floor like they belonged in a different kind of place, a place with wind and hooves and truth. Inside, the air was too cold. Penley's office was coated in soft greens and pastel blues, but there was nothing soft about the woman behind the desk. Her makeup was sharp, her hair pulled tight into a bun that seemed to defy physics. "Please sit," she said. Samantha did not. "I know what my dad's doing," Samantha said instead. Penley arched a single brow. "That's a bold way to start a conversation, young lady. I saw the paper. He forged a signature to sell Echo Ridge to the gas company. That's protected land. It was set aside decades ago. My grandma even fought for it." Penley let out a theatrical sigh and leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers like a judge ready to pass sentence. "Samantha," she said slowly, "you've been under a lot of pressure lately, haven't you?" "What?" "With your mother's passing and your father's long hours. I know it can be hard." Samantha's mouth tightened. Her mother had been dead for 3 years. They didn't talk about her anymore. Her name had become a ghost the Langston household refused to admit was still knocking at the door. "I'm not confused," she said coldly. He lied. Penley's eyes darkened just slightly. "And what exactly would you have me do about it? Call the county, the press?" Samantha didn't blink. "Yes, if you had a spine." Penley stood. Her voice dropped its softness like a snake shedding skin. "I've been very patient with you, Samantha. But this little pattern of yours, defiance, impulsiveness, baseless accusations, has become a concern." "What pattern? I've never even—" "I spoke with your father last night. He's worried about you." Now the room shrank. Samantha felt her heartbeat go sharp. "Worried," she repeated. Penley nodded, moving around the desk with a polished grace. "He says you've been emotionally volatile, isolating yourself, making up stories, refusing meals." Samantha took a step back. "He says he's afraid you might hurt yourself." "That's not true." Penley was already reaching for the manila folder on her desk, pulling out a stack of printed forms. "This is a recommendation," she said. "Greenfield's Youth Wellness Center. It's a private facility, very prestigious. They offer structure, discipline, a therapeutic environment for teenagers who need help navigating difficult transitions." Samantha's voice turned to steel. "This is because I told the truth." "You are not being punished," Samantha Penley said smoothly. "You're being given a chance to recover." "From what?" Penley's face didn't flinch. "From yourself." The door of the school slammed behind her like a verdict. Outside, her father's truck idled at the curb, dust curling around the tires. Samantha stood frozen for a moment, the air heavy in her lungs. The Texas heat pressed in around her, like a blanket soaked in gasoline. Harvey leaned over and popped the passenger door open. He didn't look at her. She climbed in. They drove in silence. She counted the white dashes of the road like heartbeats. 26, 40, 82, each one slicing deeper. "I don't need help," she said eventually. He didn't answer. I'm not crazy. Harvey's jaw twitched. His eyes stayed on the road. I saw the paper. Still nothing. Say something. He exhaled a slow hiss. I don't have to explain myself to a 13-year-old. You do if she's the only one telling the truth. Now he turned to look at her, just long enough for the truck to drift slightly over the yellow line. You have no idea what you're talking about. None. You think land stays land just by wishing it would. This world runs on power, Sam. And if we don't hold some of it, we get crushed. You're crushing everything anyway. The silence that followed was not empty. It was packed tight with things neither of them could name. They pulled into the driveway. A black van was already waiting, unmarked. The kind of vehicle that didn't belong anywhere but looked official enough not to be questioned. Two men stood outside it. They weren't smiling. Samantha's fingers curled around the seatbelt. You're really doing this? Harvey didn't meet her eyes. You'll thank me one day. No, she said. I won't. One of the men stepped forward. You must be Samantha. We'll take it from here, Mr. Langston. Her father got out of the truck without a word. The men were gentle, but final. She was handed a small duffel with clothes. Told she'd have her own room. That it wasn't jail. That it was a place to grow. But even at 13, Samantha had learned the smell of bullshit. As she was guided into the van, she turned her head one last time. Her father stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Samantha didn't cry, but her face cracked just slightly. The ride was long. Too long for the miles they covered. Greenfields was north of town, tucked into a dry basin, surrounded by old cotton fields that hadn't yielded in years. The windows of the van were tinted, but not enough to hide the truth. Fences topped with coils of wire. Watchtowers that looked decorative but weren't. As they approached, she saw other kids, some working in the gardens, some moving in stiff lines from building to building. No one talked. No one looked up. The gates opened with a buzz. The van pulled through. Inside, everything was beige. The walls, the floors, the voices of the staff. It was the color of obedience. They took her picture, made her sign papers, escorted her to her room. Bare cot. One blanket. A desk screwed into the wall. You'll begin orientation tomorrow, the counselor said. Samantha said nothing. That night she lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Somewhere in the walls, pipes hissed like snakes. From a distant corridor she heard someone crying. Or maybe laughing. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. The next morning she was assigned to barn detail, which turned out to mean cleaning stalls, feeding hay, and scrubbing troughs, under the silent watch of a supervisor with a clipboard and a whistle. The barn was hot and smelled like neglect. But it was the only place that didn't feel like a lie, and it's where she saw him, in the last stall. A gray horse, old and tall, with a single white scar slashed across his shoulder like lightning. He was chained, not just tethered, but actually chained, one thick iron link fastened to his bridle and anchored to the beam behind him. He didn't move when she approached, didn't snort or stomp, just stood watching. And then she saw his eyes. That color again, stormy ash, not dull, not broken, just waiting. Who are you? She whispered. He blinked once, slowly. A long breath passed through his nostrils, warm and even. Samantha glanced at the clipboard the supervisor had left leaning against the gate. No name, just a number 73B. But that wasn't right. She could feel it. This horse had a name, a real one. Somewhere deep in her chest, she felt it move like a memory she hadn't lived yet. Bristle, she said, not knowing why. The horse flicked an ear. A pause. And then so small it could have been missed, he nodded. Later during lunch, she sat alone at the far edge of the cafeteria. The food was gray and forgettable. The room was loud, but no one talked. Across the yard, she could see the barn. And in the shadow of the doorway, just barely visible through the heat haze, stood the silhouette of Bristle, still watching, still waiting. And suddenly, for the first time since she arrived, Samantha didn't feel alone. She felt chosen, as if someone or something had been expecting her all along. The sun didn't rise over Greenfields. It leaked in like smoke through a cracked window. Every morning began the same, the shriek of the whistle, the cold sting of iron water in the showers, the clatter of boots on linoleum. No greetings, no breakfast music, just instructions shouted in clipped syllables. Move. Report. Obey. Samantha folded her blanket with hands that refused to tremble. Her room had no mirror, no clock. Time lived in her bones now, measured in heartbeats and the grind of discipline. Outside, the other kids lined up without being told. They always did. Because the rules weren't written on the walls, they were carved into the air. Eyes forward, feet even, faces empty. A voice barked from a megaphone overhead. Unit 3, report to agriculture. Unit 4, sanitation. Unit 5, barn detail. Unit 5, that was her. She didn't speak. She didn't nod. She just moved. They walked in 2 columns across the cracked asphalt courtyard. Above them, cameras turned slowly on their black stems, scanning as if searching for the thought of rebellion. Samantha caught one watching her. She held its gaze, didn't blink. The barn loomed at the edge of the property, a long, sagging structure that smelled of ammonia hay and secrets. Inside, shafts of light cut through the dust, catching the glitter of particles that danced like ghosts in the stillness. The supervisor, Miss Greer, met them at the doors. Late 40s, uniform too tight at the shoulders, clipboard glued to her arm like an extra limb. No smile, no small talk, just orders. Stalls 3 through 9 need mucking. Hay goes to bins, not floor. Watch the one in stall 11, he bites. Gloves on at all times. Don't pet the animals. They're not yours. Her voice sounded like someone chewing gravel. They got to work. Shovels scraped concrete. Buckets thudded. Chains rattled. Samantha took stall 7. She worked in silence like the others. The smell of manure didn't bother her. It was the silence that did. Not even a whisper from the kids around her. No jokes. No grumbling. Just movement. Repetition. Machinery made of bone and breath. At first she kept her head down. But then she heard it. Not a neigh, not a stamp, a sigh. Low, long, drawn from the center of something old. She turned shovel still in her grip and looked toward the end of the barn. There he was. Stall 11, Bristle. He stood like a monument. Tall but hunched slightly as though the weight of memory bent his spine more than age. His gray coat was stained with soot marks that didn't wash out. His hooves were worn but firm. And his eyes, those eyes still burned. Not with anger, not with fear, but with the kind of knowing that made you forget how to breathe. Samantha didn't move for a long time. Finally, she stepped closer. Greer's warning rang in her ears. He bites, but she ignored it. There was no menace in his posture. Just quiet. She stopped at the gate. He turned his head to face her. And there it was, again that silence, but different. Not absence. Attention. Over the next hours, she returned to him every chance she got. Just small things, dumping fresh hay into his trough, brushing a patch of dried mud from the boards of his stall. Greer never noticed. Or if she did, she didn't care. Bristle wasn't part of the official duties. He'd been written off as too old to be useful, too proud to be broken. Just another relic awaiting expiration. But to Samantha, he was the only thing in the place that wasn't dead. He never whinnied, never paced. He just watched. One afternoon, after finishing her assigned stalls, she knelt just outside his gate and pulled a grooming brush from the shared bin. She reached forward slowly, every inch earned, not assumed. Bristle didn't back away. She placed the brush on his neck. He didn't flinch. The first stroke was tentative, the second smoother. With each pass, dust rose like ash from his coat, and something like peace settled between them. Her hands moved with rhythm now, like the wind through tall grass. And Bristle, he exhaled. Long and deep. The sound made her throat tighten. The barn became her refuge. Every break, every end of shift, she came back to him. She never talked. Neither did he. Their language was simpler movement, breath, stillness. The unspoken pact of the wounded. One day she noticed the scar. It curved along his side, high on his left flank. A patch of fur twisted in the shape of a flame. Not a brand, no ranch would mark an animal like that. This was something else. Trauma made flesh. She didn't ask. She just pressed her palm gently against it. Bristle didn't move, but he did close his eyes. And in that moment, she felt something pass between them. Like the transfer of a secret neither of them had words for. A memory exchanged in silence. She rested her forehead against the stall gate. I don't belong here, she whispered. Bristle shifted his weight. They say I'm broken. His ear flicked. But I'm not. I'm just the only one who still gives a damn. He snorted soft but clear. A reply, maybe. I know what my father did, she continued. He forged that document, sold Echo Hill like it was nothing. And now he's locked me up like a mistake. She wiped her nose with her sleeve. I'm not the mistake. He is. Silence returned. Not cold this time. Close. She looked up. And Bristle, he was staring at her with such focus, such stillness, it took her breath. Not pity. Recognition, as if to say I've been caged too. The days fell into rhythm. Greer stopped checking on her. The others noticed, but didn't interfere. The barn became its own world, a pocket of time where Samantha could remember who she was. Not a problem. Not a case file. A girl, with calloused hands and a spine that wouldn't bend. Each morning she brushed Bristle. Each night she whispered into his stall. And each time she listened for that breath, that slow ember-deep sigh. It told her he was still alive, that she was too. Then came the moment that changed everything. A thunderstorm rolled in one afternoon. Fast and furious the way Texas skies do, blue one second, black the next. The barn shook under the weight of the wind. Rain hit the tin roof like fists. Greer ordered everyone inside. Samantha didn't go. She stayed, alone. Lightning flashed, illuminating Bristle in full for the first time. His coat lit like silver. His eyes caught the glow like twin lanterns. He looked less like an animal and more like an idea. She stood beside him, her palm against his cheek. "Do you remember fire?" she asked. Thunder cracked. "I think you do." He stepped forward, pressing the side of his face to hers. And then he made the sound. Not a whinny, not a snort. A breath, sharp, urgent. A call. For her. For something more. She pulled back. "What is it?" His hoof scraped the floor. Again. Then again. Not panic. Pattern. A rhythm. Like code. Morse. She stared at him. And he stared back. "You want to leave?" His muscles tensed. She nodded. "So do I." A beat. And then, for the first time since she'd arrived, Samantha smiled. Small. Crooked. But real. "We're not broken," she said. Bristle tossed his head once. And that was the moment the plan was born. Not in words. Not in writing. But in breath. In eyes. In trust. Back in her cell that night, Samantha didn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling. And in her mind, she mapped the barn. Every bolt, every chain, every loose board. She traced the scar on Bristle's side in the air with her finger. And she whispered, "We remember. We endure. And soon, we run." They found each other slowly like cracks in a frozen lake, finally reaching one another under the surface. It started in the barn, where Samantha spent more time with Bristle than she did with people. He was her quiet constant, her mirror. But it was there within the stillness of hay sweat and old wood that three shadows began to move toward hers, not with noise, but with silence. The first was Luis. She noticed him fixing a busted latch near Bristle's stall one afternoon. Crouched low with a piece of bent copper and a screwdriver he clearly wasn't supposed to have. His shirt was 2 sizes too big, his fingers raw and quick. He worked with the precision of someone who'd done this before, maybe too many times. "You're gonna get caught with that," Samantha said. Not quite a warning, not quite a challenge. Luis didn't look up. "Already got caught. Twice. What's once more? Why keep fixing stuff they break?" He shrugged. "Because I know how." She watched as he twisted the wire tighter, tested the hinge. Besides, he added, glancing at Bristle, he doesn't like broken things around him. She blinked. "You know him." Luis gave a crooked smile. "We all do." The second was Tasha. She didn't speak. Not to anyone. Not even during roll call. They called her mute, but Samantha recognized the silence wasn't absence, it was armor. Tasha showed up one morning just outside Bristle's stall, sitting cross-legged with a scrap of charcoal and a torn sheet of notebook paper. She drew with an intensity that blocked out everything else, the stomp of boots, the whistle shriek, even Greer's barking. Her fingers moved fast, almost violently, etching out the shape of Bristle's head with slashes of black. His eye, his scar, the crumple of muscle at his neck. She captured him like she was remembering, not observing. Samantha knelt beside her. "You're good," she said. Tasha didn't respond. Samantha leaned closer to see the drawing. A storm curled in the background of the image lightning behind Bristle's silhouette. "That happened, didn't it?" Samantha asked. "He survived a fire." Still no answer. Then so soft it almost didn't register, Tasha nodded. The third was Miles. He appeared like a ghost. One day he wasn't there. The next he was standing behind Bristle's stall, sketching something into the dirt with a stick. A boy with tight curly hair, broad eyes, and a silence that wasn't chosen. It was written into his bones. At first Samantha thought he was just doodling. But when she crouched to look, she realized he was drawing a map. The barn, the fences, the camera angles, every detail precise and clean. He glanced up, met her eyes. No fear, no greeting, just recognition. She pointed at the gate on the drawing. "Is that locked?" Miles nodded. She pointed at another. He shook his head. She smiled. That was how they talked. Later, she learned his name from Luis, who explained it while soldering a broken fan. Miles. Came in 2 months ago. They say he was found in a dumpster. Not because he ran, but because he wouldn't talk. System labeled him defiant. Dangerous. Because he doesn't speak. Luis shrugged. Because he's smarter than them. The 4 of them became a pattern. Not a group, not a gang. Something quieter. Something more like a current beneath still water. Every afternoon when duties were done and the staff grew lax, they gathered by Bristle's stall. Sometimes they cleaned. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. Just sat. Sometimes Luis carved small shapes from broken plastic pieces and left them on the windowsill. Tiny horses, birds, even a miniature fire engine with wheels that rolled. Sometimes Tasha drew her dreams buildings. She'd never seen forests that glowed Bristle with wings. And Miles, he drew escape. Lines, arrows, possibilities. Samantha watched them and realized something no adult had noticed. This wasn't rebellion. It was survival. The first time they touched Bristle all together was unspoken. Luis was adjusting a bridle. Tasha reached up to brush a tangle from his mane. Miles set down his latest map, leaned his head against Bristle's shoulder. Samantha watched him close his eyes and breathe in, like Bristle was a church, and they were praying. Each of them carried something broken. Luis's father had been deported when he was 9. His mother cleaned houses until her spine gave out. Then came the group homes. The incident at school with the fire alarm that wasn't his fault. And Greenfields. Tasha had been through 6 foster homes in 2 years. The last one left her with scars she didn't speak of. Only her sketchbook held them now: crooked hands, eyes without faces, doors without handles. Miles's file said selective mutism, a cold phrase for something deeper. No one knew what he'd seen, what had silenced him. But Samantha knew the silence wasn't empty. It was full of pain too big for sound. And her, she carried betrayal like a coat she couldn't take off. They didn't talk about these things, not out loud. But in the barn next to Bristle, the stories whispered anyway, in charcoal lines, in the creak of saddle leather, in the slow rise and fall of Bristle's ribs as he breathed. Each time they touched him, it was like saying, "I'm still here." Each time he stood still and let them, it was like hearing back, "So am I." One evening, lightning returned to the sky. Far off. No thunder, just a pale flickering on the horizon. They sat together in a loose circle outside the barn. Bristle behind them, chewing slowly, eyes half-lidded. Louise was working on a small device, some kind of timer, made from a kitchen egg clock and copper wire. Tasha was drawing. A bridge over a canyon, but the bridge was made of vines and light. No railings. Just courage. Miles etched shapes into the dirt compass points, stars' initials. Samantha watched them all and felt something unfamiliar swell in her chest. Not joy, not safety, something fiercer, like hope with teeth. Later that night, while walking back to their units, Samantha slowed beside Luis. "Why do you help me?" she asked. He kept his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched. "Because you looked at Bristle like he was a person." She blinked. "No one else does that," he said. "They think he's broken, old, worthless." He glanced sideways at her, same way they look at us. That night, Samantha sat on her cot, staring at the ceiling, and tried to picture freedom. It was hard. The walls pressed in too tight. But then she remembered Bristle's breath on her shoulder, the steady thud of his heart, and she realized they already had a way out. They just had to remember how to run. Together. The storm came with no warning, not the slow build of thunder on the horizon, not the polite rustle of wind through trees. This one dropped out of the sky like a judgment. One moment the yard outside Greenfields was dry and still. The next, the sky split open like a vein, bleeding rain and lightning into the dark. Samantha felt it before she heard it. She was in the barn, brushing Bristle in slow, rhythmic strokes, when the first bolt struck a tree just beyond the fence. The crack lit up the night in blue-white flame, followed by a rumble that shook the rafters. Bristle flinched just barely, but his eyes didn't show fear. They showed something else. Alertness, readiness. She looked at him. He looked back. And in that moment, she knew. It was time. The lights snapped off all at once. An audible click followed by a suffocating silence. No fans, no buzz of overhead fluorescence. Even the electric fences sizzled into quiet. Somewhere in the yard, a siren chirped once and died. The entire facility went dark. Samantha's breath caught in her chest. She turned to the stall gate. Bristle had already moved. Not away from her, but forward toward the front of his enclosure, his head pushing against the beam that had always held him back. The old chain clinked once, then again. Then, crack! The wood split with a groan. Old nails snapping from age, more than force. Bristle stepped through slow and calm, like he'd been rehearsing this moment in his dreams for years. Lightning flashed again. In it, Samantha saw his eyes. They weren't asking. They were telling her, now. She ran, out into the storm, into the mud, across the soaked gravel toward the barracks. She slipped once skinned, her knee didn't care. Found Luis crouched in the shadows near the tool shed, as if he'd been waiting for her all night. He looked up, teeth gleaming under the hood of his jacket. "You saw it too?" he asked. She nodded, soaked to the bone. "Then let's go." Miles was already outside the main corridor, holding the crude map he'd drawn by hand. Waterproofed with plastic wrap, stolen from the kitchen supply room. His fingers moved fast, pointing from point to point. North gate offline, back paddock unguarded. Service road washed out, but usable. Samantha and Louise studied it like gospel. Tasha appeared next, silent as ever, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Inside it, food rations, a flashlight, a drawing of Bristle with wings stretched wide, and a small cracked compass. "We doing this?" Louise asked. No one answered. They didn't need to. They moved. The wagon was hidden behind the hay shed. It hadn't been used in years. Rusted wheels, rotted harness, but Louise had been working on it in secret, oiling the axle, replacing the pins. They'd rigged it for silence, thick cloth over the joints to muffle sound rope loops instead of chains. Bristle was already there. He'd made his way through the rain like a phantom, unbothered by the mud, the thunder, the pounding panic that hung over the facility like a noose. His coat glistened in the downpour, scar blazing like a torch. Louise tossed the harness over his shoulders. Bristle didn't flinch, didn't question, didn't wait. Samantha took the reins. She didn't know if she could drive a wagon through a storm, but she knew she had to try. Tasha climbed in first, shielding Miles as he unfurled the map one last time, pointing left, then sharp right. Luis jumped on the back holding his homemade toolkit in one hand, the other gripping the side like a lifeline. Samantha whispered into the wind, "Let's go," and Bristle moved. The wheels groaned, then rolled. The first stretch was open ground slick with mud. Samantha leaned her weight into the reins, guiding Bristle through the narrow path between the barns and the outer fence. Miles tapped her shoulder, pointing to the camera tower dead. The blackout was total. They had time, but not much. Wind howled through the trees, bending them like dancers caught mid-collapse. Rain whipped their faces, stung their skin. Luis yelled over the storm downshift when we hit the slope. "What slope?" Samantha shouted back. Then she saw it, a dip in the terrain, an old creek bed. The road dropped steep and fast, washed in rivulets of water rushing over the path like the land was trying to cleanse itself. Bristle didn't hesitate. He took the slope like a warhorse, legs steady, hooves sure. The wagon bucked once, then steadied. Samantha held on tight, grit in her teeth, water in her eyes. They reached the bottom. Lightning ripped the sky in half again. And there, cutting through the darkness, like a memory, was the old trail. Not on any map, not part of green fields, but Bristle knew it. He turned on his own, into the brush. The trail wound through the trees like a scar, barely visible, overgrown with roots and shadow. It had once been used for fire patrols back when the ranch was a functioning operation. Now, it was forgotten. Except by him, he moved with purpose, not speed. Purpose. Each turn, each twist, each fallen branch he anticipated, adjusted, adapted. The wagon followed behind wheels, crunching soft and steady over pine needles and old ash. Inside, Tasha held Miles's hand. He watched the world blur past, wide-eyed and calm. Luis kept an eye on the rear, checking for lights, pursuit drones. Nothing. Just rain and wind, and the sound of Bristle's breath, slow, even relentless. They passed a clearing where a tree had fallen, splitting the trail. Samantha pulled back on the reins instinctively, but Bristle veered left into a thicket that looked impassable and kept going. She trusted him, didn't fight. Branches whipped her arms, scraped the side of the wagon, tore at her jacket, but the ground stayed firm beneath them. And then, open air. They emerged on the other side. Luis let out a shaky laugh. "How the hell does he know this place?" he remembers Samantha said. Luis nodded. "Yeah, so do I." They rode for what felt like hours, but could have been minutes. Time didn't move normally out here. Not in the storm, not in the dark, not when you were running from a place designed to erase you. At one point, the trees opened into a valley Samantha recognized from her childhood. An old grazing patch, abandoned long ago. It meant they were only 2 miles from the western bluff. And freedom. Suddenly, Bristle slowed, ears twitching, head lifting. Samantha tightened her grip. "What is it?" Luis leaned forward. Behind them, distant but growing, came the sound of engines, ATVs, searchlights, voices. They'd been discovered. Luis jumped down, ran to the back, pulled a makeshift tarp over the wagon bed, motioning for Tasha and Miles to get low. Samantha turned Bristle down a side path, one she hadn't seen, barely wide enough for the wagon, but shielded by thick brush on both sides. They barreled into it. The rain had eased, but the trees now glistened with water, every leaf dripping, every branch echoing with the sound of breathless escape. They cut back into the forest, up a rise, down a slope. Samantha felt her arms screaming from strain, the reins digging into her fingers like fire. But she didn't let go. Couldn't. Bristle powered forward, driven by instinct, memory, will. Finally, through the last line of trees, the bluff, wide, open, facing the lowland highway beyond. A road, a chance. Luis jumped out again, sprinted ahead to the gate that separated them from the exit trail. Locked, but not for long. He knelt, pulled out the twisted screwdriver, worked the latch with precision born of necessity. Seconds passed like hours. Behind them, the wind of engines. Closer now. Miles peeked from under the tarp, eyes wide. Tasha held his hand tighter. Luis cursed once, then clicked. Unlocked. He flung the gate open. Samantha whipped the reins once, twice. Bristle charged. They crossed, onto the gravel road, into the open, free. They didn't stop. Not until the storm was behind them. Not until the trees were gone. Not until the sound of ATVs vanished into the night. Not until they reached the ridge, Echo Ridge, where Samantha knew the land would finally protect them, not trap them. She turned in her seat. Luis was laughing. Tasha was crying. Miles reached out, grabbed Samantha's hand, held it. Bristle stood tall at the front of the wagon, nostrils flared, chest rising and falling like a bellows. And Samantha, soaked, shaking free, looked up at the sky. The clouds were breaking, and through them the first stars of morning. She whispered to Bristle, barely loud enough for the others to hear. "You remembered the way." And Bristle, silent, steady, flicked his ear, as if to say, "So did you." By dawn the storm had passed, but the land Bristle led them into was not calm. It was haunted. The forest that opened before them didn't belong to the maps. The trees were blackened at their roots, trunks, half-split branches skeletal against the soft morning haze. The air tasted of wet ash, and something older, like sorrow, sunk deep into the soil. Samantha sat at the reins, but she didn't steer. Bristle walked with purpose, his hooves silent against the earth, stepping around stones and ruts, as if guided by ghosts. The others were quiet in the wagon behind her. Louise, Tasha, and Miles didn't speak, not out of fear anymore, but reverence. They understood now they weren't just escaping. They were following. The path twisted into what had once been a firebreak. Samantha recognized the shape, the unnatural straightness, now overrun by brush and moss. But it was broken in places, scorched in others. The damage wasn't recent. It had happened years ago. And yet Bristle moved like he'd been here yesterday. He took a sharp left, up a rise, and the wagon lurched. Louise grabbed the side and held tight. "Where's he going?" "He knows," Samantha said softly. "Just trust him." The climb was steep. The wagon wheels groaned against the incline, caked with mud and wet leaves. A sudden gust of wind sliced through the trees at the top of the ridge, and Samantha caught her breath. Ahead, the land dropped away sharply. A bluff. Not the kind you found on postcards. This one was jagged, angry, rimmed with broken stones and sheer drops. At the far edge was a burned-out watchtower, or what remained of one twisted metal skeleton beams, collapsed inward like a rib cage. Bristle paused. He stood there staring out over the gorge beyond. Then he turned his head just slightly toward Samantha. She understood. "Here." He dipped his head. She pulled the wagon to a stop. Everyone climbed out. The wind pressed against them like a warning. But Bristle stepped forward, slow and sure, hooves ringing softly against rock. He stopped beside a long black scar in the earth, half covered by vines, now but unmistakable. A fire line. Samantha knelt beside it. The ash still lingered even after all these years. Beneath the topsoil, it was cold and fine like bone dust. Tasha crouched beside her and reached out. She drew a line through the ash with her finger. Then she started to sketch in the dirt a horse. Long legs, smoke trailing from its mane, a person slung over its back arms, limp, head low. Louise watched, eyes wide. "Is that him?" Miles nodded. Samantha didn't speak, because she was remembering too. Not from memory, from the way Bristle held himself. The stillness in his bones. The way he looked out over the burned valley like someone paying respects. He had saved someone here, many someones maybe, and lost more. Later down the slope, they found the first piece of truth. A rusted road sign half buried in Kudzu Restricted Wildfire Recovery Zone 19. Louise cleared it with a stick. Beneath it, a metal tag, faded but legible. Emergency Fire Staging, Echo Ridge Station, 2009. Samantha felt her skin tighten. "Echo Ridge," she whispered. Louise ran a hand through his wet hair. "This is where it happened." "The big one." "Yeah. They said whole teams went missing." "They didn't go missing," she murmured. "They were carried." She looked at Bristle. He stood a few feet away, chewing quietly, his eyes fixed on the sign. Tasha knelt beside him and pulled a fresh page from her sketchpad. She began to draw, not just Bristle this time, but the fire around him. The trees burning, people screaming. But Bristle calm, in the center of it, eyes clear, pulling a body from the flames. She drew others, 2 other horses behind him in silhouette. Some falling, some not making it. When she finished, she handed the picture to Miles. He stared for a long moment. Then carefully he traced a finger along the edge of one of the horse silhouettes, one that had fallen, and touched his chest. Samantha watched, her throat thick. They weren't just animals, she said. They were soldiers. They pushed on. The path narrowed as they wound through what used to be a camp, broken tents, rusted fire extinguishers, fragments of boots and gear. Bristle didn't stop here. He passed through it like someone trying not to look too long at a wound. Miles left a small stone on one of the logs, Samantha noticed. "You honoring someone?" He nodded. She placed her hand on his. "Me too." As the sun broke through the trees, light filtered down in golden shafts, catching the soot in the air, making it shimmer like ghosts. Bristle stopped again at a wide clearing. At the center, a broken-down fire engine wheels melted into the earth, its ladder half raised, like an arm reaching for help that never came. The kids moved around it slowly, reverently. Luis found an old brass bell in the brush. He polished it with the edge of his shirt, held it up. "Still rings," he whispered, and did so. The sound was soft like a memory. Bristle turned his head toward it and let out a long, slow breath. Miles sat on the ground and pulled out his sketchpad. This time he didn't draw Bristle. He drew the bell. And beside it, 5 silhouettes. 1 horse, 4 children, and the words in large block letters beneath them. "We remember." Samantha sat beside Bristle, resting her forehead against his shoulder. "He didn't forget any of it," she said. Luis knelt nearby. "No, he carries it." Tasha finished her drawing, this one different Bristle, standing on a cliff, looking back at a line of smoke children following him into the light. She handed it to Samantha. I think she whispered the first words Samantha had ever heard her say. "He's showing us the way out. Not just of the forest, of everything." Samantha swallowed hard. "Yeah." She looked up at Bristle, "because he's been through worse than us. And he's still standing." The wind rose. Samantha stood and faced the others. "We follow him," she said. No one disagreed. They climbed back into the wagon. Bristle took a breath and moved forward, down the trail, through memory, towards something more. Echo Hill appeared not as a destination, but as a reckoning. The ridge sloped gently before them, cloaked in tall grass, swaying like a sea of whispers. Wildflowers dotted the field, sun-bleached and stubborn. Above it all, standing like a sentinel lost in time, was the old fire-watch cabin. Half covered in ivy, its roof bowed, its frame weathered by wind and memory. Samantha's breath caught as Bristle led them closer. This was the one place her father had told her never to go. "That's dead land," he once said. "Rotten bones of the past." But he never looked her in the eye when he said it. And now standing here, she understood why. This wasn't just a hill. It was a witness. Bristle stopped at the foot of the cabin steps. He didn't move again. Samantha climbed down from the wagon mud, still crusted on her boots from the night's escape. Tasha, Miles, and Luis followed her, silent but alert, like they too felt the heaviness pressing down from the hilltop. The door to the cabin groaned as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and cedar. Motes danced in the morning light, seeping through the cracks in the roof. It smelled of paper-old smoke and rain, long dried. A quilt lay folded on a cot in the corner, brittle with age. A wooden table sat beneath the window, layered with maps, water-warped sketches, and the kind of stillness that made time pause. Samantha's eyes scanned the room, her heart beat in her ears. Then she saw it. A cedar box, the kind her grandmother used to keep dried herbs and letters in. It was tucked beneath the table, half hidden behind a crate of rusted lanterns. She dropped to her knees and pulled it forward. It creaked as she opened it. Inside, bundles of paper tied in twine, an old hand-drawn map of Echo Ridge, and at the bottom, a small black cassette recorder. The kind people used when they still believed in their own voices. She held it like it might break her. Luis knelt beside her. "What is it?" Samantha didn't answer. She flipped the recorder over. A label on the back, handwritten and faded, Harvey Conconf. 2017. She looked at him. Luis's eyes widened. "Play it." She did. The machine hissed to life, spitting static, then. "I don't know why I'm doing this, Helen. Maybe because you're gone. Maybe because it's eating me." Her father's voice. Softer, younger, unsure. Samantha's hands trembled. "I forged the signature. The conservation order. I used your old seal, too. Told myself it was for the family, for the ranch, for Sam. That's the lie I told myself." Silence, then a sigh. "But it's not for her. It's for the money. For the people in suits who shake my hand and look at me like I matter." Another pause. "I told her never to come here. I thought if she stayed away, she wouldn't see the mess I made. But she's like you. She sees too much. She hears the trees." The recorder clicked off. Samantha stared at the machine. No one spoke. Miles reached out and gently took the recorder from her as if it were something sacred. He set it on the table beside the map. Tasha sat down on the cot and began drawing without looking up. Samantha turned her face away. But it was too late. The tears came, but they weren't for her father. They weren't even for the lie. They were for her grandmother, the woman who had walked these woods, who had drawn these maps, who had left breadcrumbs in the form of sketches and stories and whispered warnings. The woman who had once looked at a 5-year-old girl, handed her a compass and said, "This land remembers who protects it." Samantha covered her mouth, the sob catching in her throat. Luis moved beside her. He didn't try to stop her tears. He just sat steady and quiet like a wall she could lean against. She pressed her forehead to the edge of the table. He knew, she whispered. He knew what he did, and he did it anyway. Outside, Bristle remained still at the steps, as if waiting for something to be acknowledged. Samantha wiped her face with the back of her arm and stood. She looked around this cabin again, as if seeing it for the first time. The small stove, the stacked books, the faded photograph pinned to the wall, a woman with long gray hair and a teenage girl in overalls, grinning arms around each other. She walked to it, touched it. She thought I'd be the one, Samantha said, almost to herself. She was right, Luis said behind her. Samantha turned. No, she said, not yet. They spread the documents out across the table. Luis examined the map, tracing the boundary lines, the handwritten notations. This proves the ridge was designated as a conservation zone. That means the sale was illegal. The signature he forged it was over this. He tapped the border line with his finger. Miles added a note in the corner pointing to the access road that led to the town hall records office. Tasha held up her drawing. It showed Bristle standing between two figures, one in shadow, one in light. Behind him, a forest burned. In front of him, new trees grew from ash. Samantha stared at it. Then she nodded. It's time we finish what she started. They spent the rest of the hour copying the map. Miles drafted a letter. Luis scanned documents using the hacked camera phone they'd salvaged from a camp supply crate. Tasha rolled the original papers and wrapped them in waxed cloth. When they stepped outside again, Bristle raised his head. Samantha walked down the steps toward him and placed a hand on his muzzle. "We have what we need." The horse blinked slow and steady. "But I need you to take us the rest of the way." She looked out across the land, toward the horizon where the courthouse waited, toward the place where her father had sealed her fate with ink and lies. Louise climbed into the wagon, nodding. Miles sat beside him, papers in his lap like treasure. Tasha held the recorder close to her chest. Samantha mounted the wagon bench. "Let's go." Bristle stepped forward, hooves sure on sacred ground. As they rolled down the hill, sunlight broke through the clouds above them in long streaks, catching the trees, the fields, the dirt trail ahead. Behind them, Echo Hill stood still, but it no longer waited. It remembered, and it had passed the truth on. The town of Morrow Creek was still half asleep when they arrived. It wasn't much more than a main street, 2 stoplights, a diner, a grocery, a post office, with a flag out front always stuck at half-mast. The kind of place where silence settled between buildings like dust, and everyone knew the secrets but called them something else. Samantha sat at the front of the wagon, Bristle steady beneath her hands. They had tied a damp cloth over his back to keep him from drawing too much attention. But even so, the sight of a wagon being pulled by an old gray horse down Main Street at dawn was enough to turn a few heads. Louise walked beside her, holding a small cardboard box filled with the documents from Echo Hill. Tasha cradled the tape recorder like it was made of glass. Miles kept his eyes locked on the law office sign ahead. Kellen and Price attorneys at law, former painted letters, cracked window, dusty blinds. The bell above the door rang when Samantha pushed it open. It smelled like wood polish and lost causes. Behind a cluttered desk sat a woman in her 60s. Silver-streaked hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun. Glasses hanging on a chain, hands flipping through a stack of old mail. She looked up and froze. "Sam Langston," she said like the name had been pulled from a dream she hadn't wanted to return to. Samantha stepped forward, soaked boots tapping across the tile floor. "Mrs. Kellen," she said. The woman leaned back slowly. "You've got your grandmother's eyes." "I've got her map too," Samantha replied. She placed the box on the desk with care. Kellen studied the girl for a long moment, then glanced past her out the window, where Bristle stood tethered to a post, unmoving, dignified. "You brought a witness?" she said dryly. "He remembers everything," Samantha said. Kellen removed her glasses. "Start talking." They spread the documents across the desk. The map, the sealed conservation record, the notarized signature overlays, the letters, and then the cassette tape. Samantha pressed play. The room filled with her father's voice, confessing uncertain, desperate. Kellen didn't interrupt, not once. When it ended, the silence in the room was sharp enough to cut skin. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled. "Damn." "You knew," Samantha said quietly. Kellen nodded. "I suspected. Your grandmother asked me to help block the transfer years ago, but after she passed, the pressure got too real. Threats, funding pulled, anonymous complaints about my license. I stepped down before they could disbar me." Louise spoke up. "So why not come back?" "You had the truth." "I didn't have the fight left," Kellen replied. "They made sure of that." Samantha met her eyes, then borrowed mine. Kellen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her body. A tilt of the head, a softening of the shoulders. Like a wall deciding it had stood long enough. "That tape," she gestured, "won't be admissible in court. But the forged documents? Those might be." "They were hidden," Samantha said. "Deep in a cabin my dad told me never to visit." Kellen's voice softened. "She left them for you." Tasha stepped forward, placing the drawing she'd done at the edge of the desk, a portrait of Bristle on the ridge, the children behind him, the forest behind them both. Kellen stared at it for a long time. "Where's your father now?" she asked. "Still in charge," Samantha answered. "Still making deals." "Then we're out of time." Kellen stood. The movement was slow but sure, like bones waking up from a long sleep. She walked to a tall filing cabinet in the back corner, unlocked it with a key from around her neck, and pulled out a faded manila envelope marked Langston, 2003, protected parcel ID. She opened it. Inside was a photo of Samantha as a child, sitting on her grandmother's lap. Both smiling, both looking straight into the camera like they'd seen what was coming and decided to survive it anyway. Kellen looked down at the photo, then up at Samantha. "You want me to fight?" Samantha nodded. Kellen smiled slow and sharp. "Then let's raise hell." The next hours moved like war plans. Kellen made phone calls. One to the county records office, one to a retired surveyor, one to an environmental nonprofit in Austin that used to work with Samantha's grandmother. Each time she introduced herself with authority, and each time the tone on the other end of the line shifted from confusion to fear. "This land isn't just contested," she said after the last call. "It's sacred. If we prove the conservation filing was valid and buried your father's entire acquisition collapses." Louise leaned over the desk. "But will anyone listen?" Kellen pointed to the box. They'll listen to this. She tapped the forged overlay sheet. And they'll listen to her. She nodded toward Samantha. She's the one they won't expect, and the one they can't silence. That evening, they returned to the porch outside the law office. Bristle was grazing lazily on the dry patch of grass near the sidewalk. The sky was purple with dust clouds stretched like bruises above the courthouse steeple in the distance. Samantha stood next to him, her hand resting on his shoulder. Inside the office, the copier hummed printing duplicates of documents that had once been buried under fear. Tasha sat on the curb, sketching a new scene. A courtroom made of tree roots, branches as benches. Bristle standing beside a child with fire in her eyes. Miles drew next to her, outlining a scale held by vines, justice, weighted by nature itself. Louise leaned against the post arms, crossed eyes on the courthouse across town. Samantha didn't say anything. She just looked out across the ridge, the wind playing with strands of her hair, her other hand resting on Bristle's neck. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But her eyes, they were calling. To her grandmother. To the trees. To every ancestor who had walked this land and bled into it. To every horse that had run through fire. To every truth that had been silenced. And Bristle, he looked too. Toward the hill. Toward the past. Toward the moment that would soon come. Where silence would become voice. Where memory would become evidence. Where a girl would walk into a room built for men and bring with her the forest. And everything it remembered. The courthouse in Morrow Creek had never seen a crowd like this. By noon, the benches were packed with townsfolk ranchers, in weathered denim retired firefighters, former students of Samantha's grandmother. The air buzzed with an energy that wasn't quite anger, not yet hope, but something dense with waiting. The kind of anticipation born when truth has been starved too long. A hearing had been scheduled under emergency motion after Kellen submitted the forged conservation documents, citing public interest and risk of irreversible environmental damage. The petition had been signed by over 200 locals in under 24 hours. And that was before they heard the tape. Samantha stood just outside the chamber doors, the heels of her boots resting on the cracked courthouse tile. She wore her only clean shirt tucked tight into her jeans. Her braid was pulled firm against the back of her head, not for style, but for steadiness. Her hands held a folded letter, aged, soft-edged, written in the looping, confident cursive of her grandmother. Beside her stood Bristle. They hadn't tried to stop her from bringing him in. The sheriff took one look at the burn scar along his side, the way he stood without flinching under the weight of stairs, and simply stepped aside. Inside the courtroom stilled as she entered. Every eye turned to her, and then like a ripple, every head turned again, following the sound of hooves against hardwood. Bristle entered behind her, led by Louise, his gait even deliberate. He didn't pull against the halter. He didn't spook at the lights. He walked down the aisle like he'd done it before, as if the courtroom belonged to him. Harvey Langston sat at the front defense table, flanked by two attorneys in gray suits that looked expensive and uncomfortable in equal measure. His face remained passive calm, composed, mouth tight. But when Bristle walked in, something in his jaw twitched. Not fear. Recognition. Judge Templeton cleared her throat and looked out over the full room. This hearing has been called to assess the validity of conservation claims concerning the Echo Ridge parcel and the potential criminality of land transfers tied to Mr. Harvey Langston. All parties will conduct themselves with order and respect. Kellen stood crisp and steady, years dropping from her shoulders with every word. We submit into evidence a notarized survey map, proof of conservation designation from 2003, and overlays showing forged municipal signatures tied to the 2017 transfer. We also request the court's consideration of recorded verbal testimony, not for criminal charge, but for context and character. The judge raised an eyebrow. You're aware such recordings are inadmissible in formal judgment. Kellen nodded. Yes, Your Honor. But they may help the court understand motive. Permission granted. Samantha approached the stand. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she placed the letter on the wooden rail before her, her hand resting gently on it, like grounding herself in its ink. She looked out over the crowd. Not a sea of strangers. These were people who'd eaten at her grandmother's table, who'd been taught to plant by the moon, who'd once hiked Echo Ridge to watch the wild orchids bloom in spring. My name is Samantha Langston, she began. I'm 13. And I know this isn't normal. A few chuckles broke the tension. She didn't smile. I didn't want to be here. I wanted to be riding, or drawing, or helping clean Bristle's hooves. But instead, I'm here because I saw something wrong. Because the land my family swore to protect was being sold under forged names and silent shame. She opened the letter. My grandmother, Helen Langston, wrote this to me before she passed. I didn't find it until we returned to the cabin last week. It reads, she paused, swallowed, continued. If you're reading this, Sammy, it means you're not just walking the land. You're listening to it. You're hearing what most forget to hear. Echo Hill was never just ours. It was the memory of something older than paper. Older than money. It belongs to the trees, the wind, the ash that rose and fell. And if it must be defended one day, do not raise your voice. Raise your heart. The forest does not need rage. It needs guardians. Silence. Then Kellen approached, placing the tape recorder on the desk before the judge. Pressing play, Harvey's voice filled the room. Confession, contrition, cowardice. He tried to sit still as it played, but the room was watching now, not just listening. Watching how he breathed, how his hands clenched, how the muscles in his face betrayed the practiced stoicism. When the tape ended, the room held its breath. Then softly the judge looked at him. Mr. Langston, do you have a response? Harvey stood, cleared his throat. The tape is unauthorized, he began. It was never meant for release. My signature appears on those documents, yes, but I did so under pressure. Economic conditions required. You forged a conservation record. Kellen interrupted, voice cold. I did what I had to do, he shot back. For who, Samantha asked. The question wasn't procedural, it was personal. Harvey looked at her. I did it for you. No, you didn't, she said calm. You did it so you could matter to men who would forget your name the second they drained the last barrel of gas from our soil. A murmur swept the room. Bristle shifted his weight beside her hooves, tapping once the only sound in the chamber. Samantha turned, laid a hand gently on his neck, then looked back at her father. You told me never to go to the cabin, she said. But you knew I would. You knew I'd find her words. You just hoped I'd be too late. Harvey's mouth opened, closed. No words came. Judge Templeton rapped her gavel once. We will recess for deliberation on the land status and admissibility of the documentation. This court acknowledges the public weight of the matter. As people stood shuffling slowly toward the exit, Luis joined Samantha at the front. He handed her a drawing from Miles. It was Bristle, standing in the courtroom, eyes forward. Not at Harvey, not at the judge, at her. She stepped down from the stand, walked to her father, stopped inches from him. You raised me to be strong, she said. But you forgot to tell me what for. Then she turned, walked out of the courtroom. Bristle followed her without being asked. The double doors opened, and sunlight streamed in. For the first time in weeks, Samantha felt it not warmth exactly, but light, and truth fully seen. The verdict came down on a Wednesday morning. Gray clouds hovered low over Morrow Creek, like the sky had bowed its head. Inside the courthouse, every seat was filled. There were no TV cameras, no journalists, not the kind of attention this town ever got. But the people were there. Every weather-worn face that once feared Harvey Langston's power now waited in reverent silence for it to be undone. Samantha sat beside Kellen, hands folded in her lap. Bristle was not inside this time, but she could feel him just beyond the courthouse doors, standing quiet and still, like the land itself had sent a sentinel to wait. The judge's voice rang clear, her gavel poised like punctuation. Mr. Harvey Langston, you are hereby found guilty of document falsification, fraudulent transfer of protected public land, and obstruction of environmental oversight. Sentencing is deferred pending appeal, but effective immediately. The 2017 land transfer is voided, and Echo Ridge restored to public trust. A murmur swept through the room like a gasp being held and released all at once. Then the second blow. As for Greenfield's Youth Center, this court recognizes evidence provided of systemic abuse, unlawful detainment, and exploitation of minors. The facility is ordered shut down, pending federal investigation. All current wards are to be remanded into emergency social custody under independent review. Gasps turned to tears, then to clapping. Samantha didn't move. She stared straight ahead, breath held deep in her chest, trying not to cry. Not yet. Behind her, Luis let out a long, audible exhale. Tasha covered her mouth, eyes wide and wet. Miles reached over and took Samantha's hand, his fingers warm, shaking slightly. A door had opened, and something older than Justice had walked through it. Outside, the rain finally fell, soft, cleansing, like the earth exhaling. People gathered on the courthouse steps. Some hugged. Others just stood still, soaking in the weight of the moment. No speeches were made. No one needed to explain what had changed. They had all seen the wall fall. Kellen stood beside Samantha, her arm lightly resting on the girl's shoulder. You finished what she started, the lawyer said quietly. Samantha shook her head. I just followed her map. Sometimes that's all it takes. Behind them, Harvey Langston was escorted into a cruiser. He didn't resist, didn't speak. Just one look, half pain, half pride as he passed his daughter. She didn't return it. She was looking at the rain. Later that day, a gathering was held at Echo Hill. No permits, no formality, just people returning to the place that had almost been stolen. They brought candles, wildflowers, names, memories. A few old firefighters even wore their badges again. Samantha stood at the edge of the bluff, overlooking the green stretching wide into the horizon. Behind her, the field hummed with life, kids playing, someone strumming a banjo, voices laughing like the land was learning to breathe again. Kellen approached with a folded piece of paper. They want you to read this. Samantha unfolded it. It was a letter from the Echo Ridge Land Trust, officially naming her honorary steward of the ridge, a ceremonial title, but more than symbolic. She looked up at Kellen. I'm 13. Kellen smiled. Your grandmother was 12 when she wrote the first petition to save this hill. Samantha turned to the crowd. People noticed. Louise nodded. Tasha stood beside Miles' sketchbook in hand. And Bristle, he was standing just behind her, where the grass grew highest. She stepped forward and spoke. Not loud, not formal, just real. This place belongs to more than us, she began. And if we're going to keep it alive, we have to keep listening. She placed the title certificate at the base of a newly planted oak sapling. For everyone who carried this place before us, she said, and everyone who will after. The crowd clapped softly. A few tears, a few cheers. But Samantha didn't stay long. She turned, walked toward Bristle. It was near sunset when it happened. The group had wandered back to the cabin, small clusters peeling off into quiet. Samantha was brushing Bristle's coat with slow, even strokes. The others were nearby, Louise, tinkering with a wind chime, Tasha drawing a new mural on the side of the barn with chalk, and Miles sitting under the tree sketchbook in his lap. Then, a whisper, soft, almost missed. Thank you. Samantha froze. Her brush paused mid-stroke. She turned. Miles was staring at Bristle eyes, wide mouth half open. He said it again, a little stronger. Thank you. Bristle. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to stop. Louise's head turned slowly. Tasha dropped her chalk. Samantha stepped closer, tears springing uninvited to her eyes. You spoke, she whispered. Miles nodded. Then he placed a hand over his heart and pointed to the horse. Bristle turned his head just slightly. Their eyes met, and for the first time, something changed in his face. Not just understanding. Peace. The next morning, Samantha found Bristle standing on the ridge alone. The sunrise painted his coat in hues of gold and silver. His ears flicked back as she approached, but he didn't turn. She walked up beside him and looked out over the land. The forest, the cabins, the trails, the trees returning. You remember it all, don't you? She whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She placed a hand on his neck. We'll take care of it now. He blinked slowly, and then lifted his head, eyes wide, looking not at the ridge, but beyond it, toward the forest, toward the place where the old scars lived, toward healing. And in that moment, Samantha knew he wasn't watching for danger. He was watching for what comes next, and what comes next would be better. 1 year later, the sun rose over Echo Ridge with a quiet reverence, as if even the light knew to tread gently. The field near the rebuilt fire station was alive with footsteps and folded chairs, hand-lettered signs, and the hum of soft-spoken joy. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves. Veterans stood with worn hands clasped over their belts, and elders watched with the patient calm of those who'd seen the land change and change again. At the center of it all stood the monument, 8 feet tall, solid bronze. It was Bristle, every muscle and memory captured in metal. His head was raised not high and proud, but steady. His eyes were carved with such care that even from a distance they glinted. Not in defiance, not in pain, in remembrance. He stood with one front hoof slightly forward, like he was mid-step, caught forever in the motion of leading. And he faced the hill, always. Samantha stood just behind the podium, fingers brushing the wooden edge. She was taller now, her voice more grounded when she spoke. But the same fire flickered behind her eyes. The same fire Bristle once carried through ash and wind. She wore a denim jacket with a stitched patch that read, Caretaker of Echo. On her wrist hung a leather bracelet. Miles had made it woven from old tack straps, burned with tiny letters for those who remember. Louise stood nearby now, wearing the green uniform of a university conservation intern. He had grease on his hands, mud on his boots, and designs for sustainable water reclamation in his backpack. Tasha, a year into her fine arts scholarship, had just completed a mural on the firehouse wall. A living forest drawn in bold pastels, animals emerging from flame into bloom. And in the center, Bristle wings unfurled not as fantasy, but as memory fulfilled. Miles stood at the edge of the stage holding a freshly published children's book in his hands. On the cover, a girl, a horse, and a hill. Title, The One Who Remembered. He smiled at Samantha, then nodded. She took a breath and stepped to the microphone. I was 13 when I saw the truth. Her voice didn't shake. She looked out over the crowd faces she'd once feared, now friends. Survivors, witnesses, carriers of flame and seed alike. I thought truth would come like thunder. But it came quiet. In a barn. In the eyes of a horse who never forgot. She turned slightly, looked up at the statue behind her. Bristle didn't speak. But he listened better than anyone I've ever known. He carried fire children memory. And when no one else believed, he walked forward. She paused. Let silence speak. Some stories you don't tell with words. You tell them with presence, with breath, with courage. This, she gestured behind her, this isn't just a statue. It's a promise. That no one, no creature, no piece of land entrusted to us will ever be forgotten again. The crowd rose, clapping not with fanfare, but with something older, deeper, gratitude. Bristle's image stood still bronze, catching the golden morning light like a living thing. And in that moment, the field didn't feel like a monument site. It felt like sacred ground. After the ceremony, Samantha slipped away from the crowd, past the mural, past the tables of lemonade and wildflower seed packets. She walked up the slope to the edge of the ridge, where grass grew tall and soft. The wind there was constant, honest. She knelt, brushing her fingers against the dirt. "This is yours now," she whispered. "But I'll walk it for you." A moment later, footsteps padded beside her. It was Miles. He didn't speak, just handed her a folded note. She opened it. Inside, in his careful handwriting, "Thank you for teaching me to listen." She smiled. "Bristle did that," she said. Miles pointed to her chest, shook his head. "You did." They returned to the schoolhouse that afternoon, where Samantha had agreed to speak to a small group of kids, most younger than she had been when it all began. Some had parents who once worked the fields. Some had names etched in the forgotten files of green fields. All of them had ears and hearts. She stood before them, holding the same old compass her grandmother had once given her. "This doesn't point north," she told them. "It points home." She passed it around. "Let each kid hold it. Feel its weight. Watch the needle spin as if pulled by something invisible." They asked about Bristle. She told them the story, not all at once, but in pieces, as it deserved. When she got to the part about the night of the storm, about the wagon, and the broken gates, and the fire line, her voice grew quiet, and her eyes, just for a moment, glinted. Gray, like wind-polished stone, like ash and memory, like Bristle. That evening, the sun dropped low across the ridge. The camera pulled back, steady, slow rising above the monument, the trees, the valley now reborn, with wildflowers and the rustle of new life. It caught the tip of Bristle's ear, then his eyes, then his posture facing forward, always forward. And the wind moved gently through the tall grass, bending it like a wave around the base of the statue, as if even the land had paused to remember. And far beyond the trees, the echo moved, not of noise, but of knowing, of breath carried, of silence broken, of a promise kept, the echo of a horse, a girl, a forest, and everything worth saving.